Hello and welcome to the HealthBridge Podcast. I'm your host, Holly B. Today, I am happy to introduce you to Elwin Robinson. He is the founder of Genetic Insights, a pioneering company that leverages genetic testing to offer personalized health and wellness strategies. His journey into the health sector was catalyzed by personal health struggles that conventional medicine failed to resolve. This experience, combined with over a decade of expertise in health and wellness businesses, led him to the transformative potential of genetics in health optimization. Elwin's mission with Genetic Insights is to empower individuals with profound insights into their genetic makeup, enabling tailored approaches to diet, exercise, and lifestyle that promote vitality and longevity. His work is driven by a passion for helping others understand and harness their own unique genetic potential to enhance the quality of their life. Elwin blew me away with the amount of valuable, incredible, in-depth information that we talked about on this episode. He is incredibly knowledgeable, and yet he can still break everything down. These kind of in-depth, detailed concepts and theories and science, and he can break them down into really understandable information that you can actually apply to your own experience or your own life. And he has also such a very well-rounded approach to health, which I really appreciate. So I want you guys to get ready. You might want to have a notebook handy because we go into a lot of detail on some pretty in-depth health concepts. We talk about autoimmunity. He brings up a theory actually that I've never been exposed to yet, which I'm really excited to continue exploring. We talk about just what is overall health? What are the fundamental things that need to be addressed when we're looking at overall health and lifestyle and, root cause of health issues. And then he gets very in depth on genetic testing and what a powerful tool that can be in your toolbox to learning how to be preventative with your health, or if you're already in the midst of a health crisis, how you can use the genetic testing to inform your approach to managing and minimizing the expression of that health issue in your life. So what I loved about this is while we got very in depth, Elwin has a really good way of explaining these concepts and explaining how, different scientific processes work in the body and breaking it down into a way that's very easy to soak in and understand. He drops a lot of knowledge on us, and I'm so appreciative of it. And this kind of stuff just, this is why I do this podcast, because he's going to expose you to a lot of ideas that you probably haven't heard before or researched before. And what more can I say? Let's just dive into this episode. Like I said, get a pen and paper ready and stay to the end because he's got something special for our listeners. So make sure you stay to hear what that is. So I'm going to zip it. Let's dive in to this amazing conversation. Elwin Robinson, welcome to the HealthBridge Podcast. We are going to dive into some really interesting, very helpful topics for our listeners today, and I'm really excited to have you here. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here.
So you, I think, have quite a health story leading up to how you got into genetic testing. And before we dive all the way into what genetic testing can tell us, I would love to hear more about your story and how you ended up here in this health and wellness world.
Sure. Well, the health and wellness world, funnily enough, I guess it could have been predicted based on my genes. What I mean by that is my dad was a microbiologist that turned into a science teacher who was like really obsessed with health stuff. He was like into organic farming and had an organic store. And back in the 1980s when that's pretty unusual. My mother was also a teacher, but an English teacher who was ill many times. I think she had her first tumor diagnosis before I was even born, and she had cancer, I know, 3 or 4 times, and she had tumors several other times. And although she did go the conventional medical route, she also went like an alternative route, certainly with the tumors. I think once it was cancer, she then went medical as well. And so I know there was this law in our house. So first of all, our house was like covered in organic health foods, herbs, all kinds of exotic jars of things and loads of vitamin tablets and all that, like spread around the house, and books about health everywhere. And then second of all, my mother would do these like protocols, like specialized diets and detox regimes and all the rest of it. And I know she would listen to these hypnosis, like self-hypnosis tapes as well about, you are healthy and, stuff, whatever. And I know that several times she made herself like better just with that. Not, as I said, I think not with the cancer, but definitely with the tumors. Like the tumors would shrink away and she'd be better. And I also noticed like she had this habit then of once she was better, she'd go right back to like eating junk food and not exercising and like taking in very negative, dramas on TV and negative thoughts and all the rest of it. So it was very interesting to see the distinction I saw repeatedly throughout my childhood. Someone who was very committed to their health and emotional well-being, getting better, and then someone who was indulging in not and getting ill again. So I saw that. But despite both my parents being into that, of course, I rebelled. I was, not into it. I mean, I got like a very early qualification in nutrition back when I was still at school. But other than that, I left school early and I, got into taking drugs and I ate junk food. I lived off like lattes all day and then maybe pizza at night and, if anything, and chocolate bars. So I lived a very unhealthy lifestyle, I would say, for a while. And I really, I overdid things. I have addictive personality for, I think, certainly partly genetic reasons at least. And so, I smoked cigarettes, but I really smoked cigarettes. I had like several packs a day and, all of this kind of stuff. So I really went into it. In my late 20s, I started to feel very unwell. My dad, when he was 40-something, he was diagnosed with ME. And I kind of had that tendency as well. So I started to have like CFS, chronic fatigue symptoms, by my late 20s. I was signed off work for a bit by a doctor, and I decided, okay, I could see where I was going. I realized I wasn't getting away with it anymore. I was going to end up like my dad or like my mother or both if I didn't change my ways in terms of health. And so I did. I changed my ways. I decided to clean up my diet. I stopped all the drugs. I stopped drinking alcohol. I stopped smoking. I went kind of extreme as well. No processed food, no this, no that. And I think after a couple of years, I went like vegan and then full vegan, like really extreme. And eventually I did start to feel healthier and better. And a lot shifted, not only my health, but also my mindset. Before that, I would say I was in a very victim state of consciousness. I was doing minimum wage work. I was, not happy with myself as well, very low self-esteem, but also I'd say just a low level of consciousness. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. Like at this point when I started to get healthier, I was maybe 28, 29. I started thinking for the first time, what would I like to contribute to the world? That's not a thought that even occurred to me before that. I was just struggling to get by, getting in more and more debt, with drugs and all the rest of it. And so I eventually realized what I'd like to do is, help other people. But all I'd done before all that is work as a chef. So I decided to work as a chef in a health food restaurant. But I'd studied it so much. I'd been studying it for a couple of years by then, and I kept studying it. And people kept coming up to me and asking me questions while I was trying to prepare food. And eventually I was like, well, maybe do you want to pay me just to sit down for half an hour and I can answer this? Because I've really got to get back to the kitchen. Like it was literally as organic as that in terms of first doing one-on-ones with people. And then people like, you should do public speaking. So I'd speak in front of, a dozen or a couple of dozen people at this restaurant. It, very organic. But eventually, I had my own like health store online. I had my own book. I had a bunch of different courses and everything was going great. I was traveling the world, doing speaking, really living a quality of life that was so much better than before. I wouldn't have even imagined it was possible in so many metrics. And I did that for almost 10 years. And then at the age of 39, suddenly, despite having this super healthy lifestyle, again, no smoking ever, no drugs ever, no alcohol ever, no processed food ever, like really strict. exercise, breathing practices, yoga, like on and on. I developed this problem. I started to have this stabbing pain on my right-hand side around the right rib cage. First thing I thought of, I was quite familiar with the Eastern system, this Taoist system of herbalism and stuff. And so I thought, okay, liver. And I, had all the medical tests first. I went to a conventional medical doctors. In fact, I went to 7. I went to a private hospital when I was in Singapore. They did MRI, CT, bloods, endo, like all of the things that they would normally do. They couldn't find any problem. I then tried a couple of other doctors. I then tried the kind of more alternative round. I saw a functional medicine doctor. I saw a microbiome expert. I saw a nutritionist. I saw a naturopath, a bunch of people like that. No one had any idea what was going on. I then thought, okay, maybe it's something structural. Even though it is affected by what I eat, it could well be, like some kind of misalignment or something. So then I went to osteopaths, chiropractors, craniosacral therapists, physios, all kinds of other more out there things that are supposed to realign your muscular skeletal system. None of that helped at all. And I learned a lot of interesting stuff along the way with all of this stuff, but none of it actually resolved the problem. Then I was like, okay, maybe this is some kind of psychological, emotional issue. Maybe the kind of medical doctors I saw early on who kind of looked at me as if I was a hypochondriac, although I didn't say it. Maybe they're right? Maybe I'm manifesting this. So maybe this is an emotional thing. So I started working on my emotions. I started seeing a therapist. I saw, like a traditional normal therapist. I started to do all kinds of other spiritual stuff, emotional stuff. I did Joe Dispenza's system of, manifesting the health I want every day, all of that kind of stuff. That didn't work, unless you want to believe maybe that later on the stuff that did work was because of that, but whatever. On the face of it, at least it didn't work. It wasn't one of those things where, I realized it's because of this emotion or something. There wasn't anything like that. And so, this has gone on several years now. When I say I had this pain, so it was a pain that had a couple of interesting things about it. First of all, I think over 50% of people over the age of 40 have chronic pains. This is not unusual, but most people's pain can be treated with painkillers. This is a specific type of pain where NSAIDs, Tylenol, all that kind of thing didn't work, which is not that uncommon. There's actually also a type of pain where opioids made it substantially worse. And so that's usually the go-to thing when NSAIDs don't work. So it was a pain for which there was no relief. There was no painkillers that was actually effective for it. It was a pain that often got worse when I ate. And so I was always a bit underweight. I'm 6'3". I was about 150 pounds for most of my adult life. But, kind of a year into this process of this pain, I was down to 125 pounds. I felt cold all the time. I had constant anxiety. I couldn't sleep. It's very interesting when eating always seems to cause a sharp stabbing pain. You become a bit paranoid about eating, I can tell you. And so, I developed this unhealthy relationship around food. And, I realized now I was kind of starving for nutrients despite having this healthy diet for so long because I just wasn't eating enough because of this issue. And yeah, I could go on and on, but yeah, it was not great. And the main issue was that no one knew what was going on with me. And so it's the uncertainty, right? I had all kinds of diagnoses. At one point, a medical doctor told me I had Brugada syndrome, which is like a cardiac diagnosis that is genetically based, that basically the average age that you die if you have it is 40. And I was given this diagnosis when I was 40. It means that you can't get on a plane, all this kind of stuff. Anyway, after a while, another specialist saw me and he said, actually, you don't have it. But, I had an interesting experience of facing, oh my God, I'm going to die because of genetics thanks to that. Anyway, long story short, studying it for years, did all kinds of testing myself as well, didn't really turn up any answers. Eventually, I come across this platform and it says, if you've ever done a genetic test like Ancestry.com or 23andMe, you can upload your results from that to us. And within a few hours, we're going to tell you all of this information about you, about your health, about your well-being, just with that raw data. And as I said, I tried all kinds of tests then, both myself and with various practitioners. And I was like, why not? So I remembered I did a 23andMe back in 2013. And I managed to find it, whatever it was, 8-9 years later, dig it out. Okay. When I got those results, I was blown away. I was like, wow. So first of all, the amount of information that it was able to give was very impressive. But much more important than that, it was the accuracy of it was really stunning. All kinds of things about myself. I'd love to be able to say, for the sake of the story, that it just told me that was wrong with me. But unfortunately, it wasn't as simple as that. But what it did is it provided several important clues, which ultimately made me able to work it out and then get it confirmed with 2 different medical diagnoses. But, more importantly, and I guess working out the specific thing that was wrong with me, was actually the root causes. And that's what it actually helped me to discover. What were the root causes of what was going wrong, despite the fact that I'd been having this, totally healthy lifestyle for over 10 years. And, that was invaluable. And honestly, the level of accuracy and helpfulness was stunning, but I am skeptical by nature. So I thought maybe this is a fluke or whatever. So, I got my wife to do it. Then I got several friends to do it. I got all my business partners to do it. I got all the family members and employees to do it that were willing. And so, I saw, I don't know, a couple of dozen or something like that over the course of a few months. And I was like, wow, this is consistently very helpful and very impressive. And then, I had the opportunity to, the one things I didn't like about that report to kind of spread out into the world, like just to recommend it to other people, was the system itself was very complex. It seemed to be designed more for practitioners. Like you need to have a bit of science and, backgrounds in order to really understand it, which I think is unfortunately common for a lot of these platforms. And the other thing was the cost was pretty high. And I was in a very fortunate position. I could afford to do all this stuff, but I know a lot of people aren't. So that was like the 2 things holding me back. But then I, through a miracle of synchronicities and all the rest, I got the opportunity to take that technology and take that basic information and create my own platform that had that, but that was substantially simpler for people to use and that was cheaper. And so that's then what I committed myself to. And it took a long time. It took about 2 years to build that. But the last year I've been getting it out there and letting people know that such a thing exists. And I think that is the main challenge. People have either not heard that anything like this exists, which is the vast majority of people. And then the second most common thing, and this is more common with practitioners like yourself, is they have heard of it, but they've often tried systems that have better marketing behind them, but are actually vastly inferior in terms of the technology that they utilize. And so, it's my mission to talk to as many people as possible and tell them, how helpful this can potentially be. And, I think my story is actually not a bad example because I don't want to claim that if you do this, it will give you all the answers. But what I would say, just like in my case, I still had to go and investigate and do some blood tests to confirm things afterwards and work things out. But what I have found now, working with a lot of people as well, since, clients and whatnot, that very consistently, it's not that this takes the place of doing blood tests, which I'm a big fan of, or saliva tests or urine tests or any other kind of testing. I'm a huge fan of all of that kind of testing. It's more that like it's an essential add-on to it. And for me, I have a 7-step system I call the Rejuvenate Blueprint. This is the first step of that process. It's not the only step, but for me, like knowing what the blueprint is that you've been given genetically is extremely helpful for everything else that follows from there. And it's still, important to find out about nutrition and what's the right nutrients for you, what nutrients you might need more of. And it's still important to find out if there's any toxin buildup in your system and anything your body struggles with. And it's still important to balance your hormones and all of that other kind of stuff that people talk about. And the genetics can be helpful with things like that as well. But to me, these days, what I want to say to people and practitioners is it's the first step. It's the essential prerequisite to know, what is the building blocks that you have been given? And then we can look at, okay, and now since then, what's happened in your life, And yeah, just to say, why was it my mission, other than seeing it was very accurate and helpful and all the rest of it? The biggest thing to me was I realized, so I did that genetic saliva test back in 2013. I then took that raw data and put it into the system in I think it was late 21. I didn't have any of these problems back in 2013 that I ended up having in 21. And so if could have gone back in time and given myself that information back then, I could have prevented very likely any of these problems from occurring in the first place, or, could have gone through substantially less suffering at least. And so that was kind of the main mission, is like the earlier that people get this information, I mean, absolutely. Can it help you work out what's going on for you if you have some obscure thing? Quite possibly, although obviously we can't guarantee that. But the better promise to me is it can help prevent all of those things from occurring later that you have a genetic tendency for, but that you're certainly not guaranteed to have. And in fact, we're not allowed to say, just like anyone in the non-pharmaceutical space, that we can help to, prevent, cure, treat any disease, etc. But we are allowed to say that we can mitigate the risk, because that is accurate. We can reduce your risk of developing different issues because knowledge is power. Oh, I have an increased genetic tendency for this. There are absolutely things we can do to prevent it. And so helping people do that, is my passion.
Everything that you just said, but I love that you talked about getting to the root cause. And that's a big key point for me too when I work with people, is working on getting to some of the root causes that can contribute to dysfunction in the body. I go about it, of course, a different way. We look at all the health fundamentals, starting with mindset, looking at nutrition, looking at hydration, looking at circadian rhythm, movement, breath, that sort of, those foundational things. But on top of that, looking at, past traumas, emotional aspects of these things too, all of which I believe lead to like a discoherence in the body. So when we're talking about autoimmunity, your body's not communicating correctly with itself. So how do we reestablish that communication system? And so when you're talking about root cause, when it comes to genetics, this can give us another huge key, potential indicators of certain things that would be very helpful to know preventatively, or if we already are experiencing autoimmune conditions or, other health issues as well. Outside of that, you're basically giving us more tools in our toolbox to work with. And
Yes.
what's also interesting is you said that, this can basically be used for preventative action. So people that are, excited about health, maybe know that they have some genetic issues that things that tend to run in the families, and they want to get on top of these things. But also, if you're already in the throes of some health issue, you can add this to your information 101 packet about yourself and look at, now that
Yes.
I have this, we can go back and say, okay, well, what could have contributed? Is
Yeah.
that right?
Absolutely, yeah. And, just go back to what you said there about emotions and trauma, stuff like that. I absolutely, 100% agree and respect that perspective. It is the last step of my 7-step system, not because it's the least important, but because generally often what I find is it's the last thing people want to hear about when they first develop an issue. So usually you have to kind of go through the other stuff, just like I said, right? First I went to a doctor, normal doctor, and then eventually I start to think, oh, is it my emotions? And I think that's often the case when people have a physical symptom. They don't usually, go to, is it emotional trauma first? But I absolutely think, it is, or mindset. Is it a mindset issue? Am I always in a state of victimhood or whatever? That's not the first thing that people go to. But I do think it is super important. And I will say, even with something like that may not seem connected to genetics, there is actually, a strong correlation to genetics. So one of the reports references psychological trauma. And obviously your genetics cannot predict whether you will suffer psychological trauma in your life, because that is an external, happening. But it can predict how you respond to psychological trauma. So there are some people who go through really awful things, and to some degree they can shrug it off. I mean, obviously to some degree, but some people are very resilient and some people are not. Some people go through things that maybe other people would objectively say is not a big deal, and it still haunts them. They wake up at night like screaming and they're thinking about it, and they can't let it go. They can't stop thinking about it. And so that's a genetic tendency. Other things that profoundly affect how you feel is, for instance, the hormones and the neurotransmitters. I know I often look at that with people. Like, I have never been very emotionally resilient. I'm happy to, acknowledge that. I was always jealous of the people who were like, oh, it's no big deal. They can easily shrug things off. And then looking at my genes, and I saw, I have a high genetic tendency for cortisol. It's fairly unusual. 10 to 20% of the population have it. And so what that means is I'm always running on high cortisol, high adrenaline, or I was until I actually addressed that. And so, and I have to mitigate that, meaning like if I do the same thing as a normal person to be calm and not stressed, it won't be enough. I have to do more than a normal person to be as relaxed as a normal person because I have that genetic tendency, if that makes sense. I also found out I have a specific gene, genetic variants, we can talk about that if you want, that basically means I'm not very good at breaking down stress chemicals, especially what are called the catecholamines, adrenaline, noradrenaline, and dopamine. It's known as the COMT gene. It's a fairly well-known gene, as much as any gene is well-known. And what this means is when you are slow to break those down, it means that things often upset you and bother you for a lot longer than if you're quick to break those things down. And so even things like personality, like, the big five from psychology, like introvert, extrovert, feeling secure, neurotic, that kind of thing. So they have about 40, 50% of whether you are, what you are on that personality scale is based on the genetics. So when I see someone who's, very high on the scale of neuroticism or something like that, there's no point telling people like that, oh, just focus on the positive. Just let it go. Like that's extremely difficult for someone with those genetics. Telling someone with a high level of neuroticism to, why do you always focus on the negative? Why? Like, because that is a very strong genetic tendency for them, right? And so we have to honor that tendency to depressions, tendency for, bipolar, tendency for borderline, even all of these kind of things. There is a genetic component to that. And, you may not be actually going through real clinical depression or bipolar or borderline or whatever, but seeing that you have a genetic tendency, you're like, actually my moods are quite up and down. I'm not borderline, but so rather than feeling bad about myself because my moods are all up and down, I can actually feel good about myself that I don't, that I haven't manifested this full blown, and I can start doing things to, honor the fact that I do have this tendency to be up and down and help to bring myself back into balance and not feel bad about myself. So to me, I don't always talk about this, but, as we talked about emotions and trauma and stuff, a huge gift of this system for me was actually about self-compassion and then like compassion, understanding for others. Because as much as we all try and be compassionate and empathetic, it is very hard for some more than others, but it is very hard in general to truly see things as another person sees it, and, so for instance, someone who's quite compassionate, it's very hard for them to understand how someone could be not compassionate and ruthless, whatever. Like there's always something where it's very hard to see someone else's point of view. And when you see their, a person's genetics, you go, oh, okay, so they have this tendency. It's been so helpful for me, not just in, relationships, although it definitely has, but even in, business or, working with people and just, oh, okay, you have that tendency and I don't have that tendency, but I have a different tendency, which is also not ideal. And like, we can just, understand each other and have patience and compassion for each other, I think. And to me, genetics really actually helps with that rather than, I don't think it's about putting yourself in the box of, oh, this is just the way I am, because as I said, we can improve all these things, but it is about going, you know what, it is harder for me than someone else. So just because I have a genetic report saying I have a higher risk of being depressed, for instance, doesn't mean I'm going to be depressed, doesn't mean I have to be depressed, but it does mean if I find it harder to be happier than you, that's not me being silly or making it up. That's real, that it is harder for me. And so therefore, if I'm not depressed, I can go, wow, I'm doing really well, and like honor and acknowledge that.
Like I'm picking up on so many interesting correlations with what you said. I work with someone who is very in depth in astrology,
Mm-hmm.
which is, kind of can be considered woo or out there. But I think that when you are in depth in that field, it can give similar types of information about people and personality types, not to the extent of the genetic testing, but just more on a like emotional and just how people move through the world. So I find that to be an interesting correlation, more of a side note. But what I'm really saying is when someone has an autoimmune disease, especially with lupus, who is the general group that I work with the most, it can take an average of 7 years to get a diagnosis.
Mm.
And you can go through these stages of feeling crazy. Like nobody's finding anything wrong. My blood work looks normal. People are telling me it's in my head, all this stuff. And then when you finally do get an actual diagnosis, it's kind of freeing because it's like, oh, this explains it. I'm not
Mm.
crazy. And so kind of just another interesting correlation there between when you finally see your genetic markers and it's like, oh, well, that's why I have such a hard time. Like it's
Mm.
in my genetics that I have a hard time letting go of certain things or a hard time digesting certain foods or whatever the case may be. So my next question is, what do people do with this information? Because you can either let it just say, oh, this explains me, and it gives you a free pass to just continue on as you are because, well, the genetics said so. Or you can use this information to figure out really how to up level your health and your life overall. So, I don't know, what have you seen with people that you've worked with? Do people take both roads? And if they're looking at the up leveling side of things, where do they start? Because it's a lot of information, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting philosophical question. I think just the acceptance can be quite powerful and transformative. And this is what some schools of psychology teach, right? Like I had a lady who saw that she had a tendency to be overweight. That was genetic. And now she also had a couple of other things. She had a genetic tendency to low iron, and she had a genetic tendency to low vitamin B12, but as well as a bunch of other stuff. But this is what she's given me permission to share publicly. And she kind of didn't do most of what I said, other than accept herself, first of all, that this was a genetic tendency. Second of all, she started taking those two things as a supplement. She knew she needed both of them anyway. She then confirmed that with a blood test, which I do recommend, especially in the case of iron, because you can take too much iron. B12 is pretty safe. And over the course of a few months, she lost, I think, 40, 50 pounds. Now, if I want to be scientific, I can speculate and go, okay, I think she was hypothyroid. A lot of the time, iron deficiency can kind of create a hypothyroid situation. So just by getting iron up and resolving kind of myelonemia that she had, her thyroid will start to able to work again, and she was able to lose weight. So that's the scientist cap. But if I put on my, I don't know, spiritual cap, I would go, I think the main thing that actually shifted her was she felt so much shame and guilt around her weight. And as soon as she was able to accept herself as she was, it's kind of counterintuitive. And there's a big debate about this in culture, right? Like fat shaming now is considered bad and you shouldn't do it. But some people, say that's why we've got the obesity epidemic, because we don't fat shame anymore. Other people are like, no, the more you shame people, the more they do it. Like with smokers, if you shame someone for smoking, their first instinct is to reach for a cigarette, not to put the cigarette out. So shaming doesn't really work. So that's an argument in society right now I'm not going to claim to have a final answer for, but I will say that I have seen in practice, when people accept themselves as they are, it releases so much emotional, psychological, whatever baggage, that I think that then it's actually more possible for them to change. Now, having said that, the kind of person who ends up seeing me is probably not I'm happy as I am and I'm not willing to do anything to change kind of person. So I honestly can't say, what would be the case with someone who is extremely entrenched in staying as they are, because why would they ever see me? That's not the kind of practitioner that I am. But what I will say, certainly a lot of people have that tendency, right? Because it's easier to stay the same. And I will say that, I'll put it this way. If our reports only told you your risk of something, I would not have started this business. I would not have started this mission. This would not be what I would be doing. I would find that very disempowering. And in fact, there are some reports, like cancer, for instance, where we had the option of adding them, and I said no, because when everything we do is FDA and FTC compliant, and to be FDA and FTC compliant, you cannot say that there is anything you can do to prevent those things. And I do not want to give people reports that say you have a high risk for something and there's nothing you can do. So that's why we don't include those. So that is to say, most of our reports, and certainly the ones, serious issues that are potentially life-threatening, like, for instance, heart disease, one of our most popular ones, or even, being overweight is one of our most popular ones. Most of the report is not talking about your risk of something. Most of it is recommendations, the vast majority. And the recommendations are listed in order of priority. So I always say the top 3 recommendations are going to have more an impact than all the next, 10 put together. And they're listed in order of priority based on various factors, including your genetics. They're also listed in terms of, they're given an impact score, meaning all the research out there. Is it like to have a big impact or a small impact? And they're given an evidence score. So out of all the research, is there a lot of evidence for this or just a little bit? Some things like, for instance, exercise generally has a lot of impacted evidence. Some things like some obscure herb or supplement or something, there's often not much research. And so often, those things are lower down the list. So those recommendations are really key to me. Now, often when people see me as a client, then I'll not talk about that because I'm going to talk about like other stuff that they can't just get themselves from our reports. But in our reports, there is an abundance of helpful information. Often stuff I would recommend is in the reports anyway, that helps people to change that. And like I said, if that wasn't there, if it was, and some companies do this, in fact, many do, if it was only a risk score, I would not want to do this because there is some value in telling people, but there's some, detriment in telling people. It's like, oh, you have a high risk of heart disease. Oh, great. See you later. What? How's that helping people? How's that helping humanity? But if we say you have a high risk of heart disease and here's all the things you can do about it, then, that's very empowering, I would say. And if everyone's heard kind of general recommendations about what you can do to, deal with a lot of these issues. But if you see this list and you go, oh, this isn't just generic information, although you might recognize some or many of the recommendations, this is specifically for me, then it's almost as good as having a practitioner actually give you the recommendations because it's personalized and customized to you. And so to go back to your question, from my experience, people are much more likely to do these things if it is presented to them as what it is, which is it's customized for you. It's not general. This is specifically based on your genetics, what's going to be helpful for you. And so my experience is actually people do follow through in it. Sometimes, like the lady I mentioned earlier, they only mention on follow through on a few things. But I'm actually amazed at how often those few things massively transform people. I don't want to claim it happens every time or whatever, because that would not be true. But I'm amazed how often, like a handful of nutrients that they've discovered that they have a genetic increased need for, that maybe they realized they weren't getting enough of, just taking those nutrients, they feel massively better. Or, realizing they have a tendency for a hormone to be high or low, like taking steps to create that. Like these, what I would call basic things that are often completely ignored by mainstream medicine, are absolutely transformative for people. Or to get slightly involved with autoimmunity, allergies and intolerances. People hear, and sometimes it's the obvious stuff like gluten, whatever, but sometimes it's obscure stuff that people have not heard of. Like you have a genetic tendency for a histamine intolerance, or for salicylate sensitivity, or for oxalates, or organophosphates, or mycotoxins, or something like that people may not have thought of. And then I've seen many cases where that completely transforms someone. And I'm trying to think, definitely one case of an autoimmune, someone who had Hashimoto's, where they were able to reverse that just by avoiding the things that they had no idea was constantly triggering their immune system. Because I explained to people, if you have a genuine allergy or intolerance to something, then when you have it, when you consume it anyway, or you'll breathe it in anyway, it may as well be a poison. Like I know it's just gluten, or it's just casein, or it's just oxalate or whatever, but to you, it's a poison. And so, would you expect to be healthy despite everything else you do if you are constantly consuming poison every day or every meal in large quantities? It's like, well, no. Right, okay. Well, your immune system thinks that's a poison, rightly or wrongly. And so, yes, we want to get to the root of that and hopefully stop your immune system reacting to that. But this is also where genetics become handy, because if a person has allergies and intolerances and there's no genetic basis for it, I always say that's good news, because that means that you could easily be fully cured. This might well be being caused by a congested liver, or SIBO, or leaky gut. Like something has created this intolerance, and it could also disappear completely. Whereas if there is a genetic basis for it, it doesn't mean you have to totally avoid it for the rest of your life, but it does mean, from my perspective, you're never going to be 100% okay with it, because there's the genetic basis. Sometimes, like in the case of an oxalate or something, it's like just your body's not very good at processing this natural plant toxin. Sometimes it may be that your immune system is tagging it and treating it as if it's an invader or whatever. But in either case, and the way I explain it with the genetics is, we have hundreds of reports. You can order them based on risk. So you can have like the highest risk one first. Everyone has a bunch of different high risk scores. There's no such thing as good genes or bad genes. All we tell you is, if you're not perfect, what will go wrong first? That's often the highest risk score stuff. So, for me, for instance, right at the top of that list is sinus issues. When I saw my sinus report, I was like, oh, that makes sense, because I'm like in the top 99th percentile for having sinus problems. So meaning, if I was in a room full of 100 people, I would be most likely to have sinus problems in that room, just on a genetic basis. And I'd always had that. And what I'd experienced is, as soon as I wasn't optimal, as soon as I ate the wrong food, as soon as I got stressed, as soon as I didn't sleep enough, whatever, and this is well before I developed any of these other problems, even back in my teens and my 20s, immediately I would feel it in my sinuses. But what I realized is that's me. For someone else, they might have digestive systems, someone else, they might have headaches. And then for other people who say, oh, I never get sick, I never have health problems, if I look at them, often it manifests more mentally or emotionally. It shows up as brain fog, it shows up as memory issues, it shows up as depression, it shows up as anxiety, because a lot of these things are just related where the inflammation is more in the brain rather than in the digestive tract or the sinuses or whatever. So it can tell you where things are most likely to go wrong first. And so I say that to go back to the food intolerances thing. If you have a very high risk score for food intolerances, then it may be the case that you're going to have issues or flare-ups unless you're perfect. But if you have like a medium issue, then it means so long as you keep yourself pretty good in every other way, then you don't have to have an issue, so it helps you even quantify in that way.
Yeah, and it can inform you. So like, if I know that I have issues with certain foods and I can handle it, sometimes on occasion, if I have other things going on in my life that might trigger flares, like extra stress, or I haven't been sleeping well, that's not the time when I should choose to indulge on those foods, right? So we can get like more information on just, when things might be a little more okay and smooth for us to do certain things and when we should hold back.
Exactly. And unfortunately, as you well know, it's actually the opposite, right? It's when people are already stressed and tired and all the rest that they're going to reach for the pizza or the ice cream or whatever it is. That's the trigger. But again, I find, look, you talked about astrology earlier, you talked about energy. I think the world that we live in, science is generally the new religion for people, right? Rightly or wrongly. I think this is mainly due to technology rather than because people often really understand science. But it's like, wow, science means I can get in a metal box and, a few hours later be in the other side of the planet. Science means that, you and I can talk despite being on opposite sides of the earth. Like, there's a lot of things that are very impressive about science. And I think for that reason, science has kind of superseded, most other things as what people like have belief in and have awe in and all the rest of it. And so I don't agree with that being the way it is, but I do try and face reality as it is. And so because of that, I think genetics is a very easy thing for people to accept. And so if you say to someone, you should eat this way or not eat this or whatever because of astrology or because I feel it in my vibes, you may be 100% right, but people are less likely to listen. Whereas if you say, I think you should do this or not do this because of your genes, because that is the dominant paradigm right now of, what people believe and in many cases even worship, unquestioningly, it's a great tool to really help them because you can easily go, well, that person was very convincing at the time, but I don't really believe their vibes thing. But it's hard to go, I don't believe in genetics. Like that's like going against the dominant paradigm of the time. So I think that's also how it can be helpful to not just, for a practitioner helping someone, but even you helping yourself, right? If you're like, oh, I think every time I eat this, I feel unwell, but people question, they doubt their own intuition and their own experience sometimes. So, it's very helpful to have it there in black and white with a bunch of scientific citations. It's in your genes.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I totally agree with you. I think there's a lot of really great information out there, but a lot of it isn't solidified, like you say, in scientific thought or theory. And so, you know, it's hard to know. It's just hard to know. And we're so out of tune, I think, partially because of science and partially because of technology and all these other things with how we built our lives. We are, I think, really out of tune with our intuition. So it really helps to have a really good guidebook. And that's what the genetic testing can offer.
Mm.
Um,
And it almost seems like magic when you see it. I mean, honestly, I've never gone to like a psychic or a fortune teller and been blown away. I've seen it in movies and stuff. It was like that for me. I was like, how does it know all this stuff about me? And, I used to have paranoid issues back in my 20s when I did lots of drugs, unsurprisingly. And so I could kind of imagine going into that paranoid thing of like, oh, they've been spying on me. And like, that's the only way that it's possible for them to know all this kind of information. And yet, like, I'm not dismissive of the stuff about energy and stuff. I studied a lot about ancient Egypt, and it's very interesting. The system of medicine that they had back then was actually quite, even if you dismiss all the theories about, how it was way older than it, the archaeologists think and all that stuff, just based on the mainstream science, it was very interesting the level of proficiency they had in medicine and healing people. And it's very interesting that for them, because they lived in a magical universe, like in terms of their experience of reality, like they believed in all that stuff 100%, rightly or wrongly, part of the process of healing someone for the doctor, healer, whatever, would be like they would embody this divine healing deity, this nature, they would call it. And, we scoff at that these days in modern day science. But, when you study the placebo effect and you understand that the power that belief has, and the nocebo effect, the power that belief can have to heal or hurt someone. And I can see there's a huge amount of value in believing that the person giving you these herbs or even doing this surgical procedure on you or whatever it may have been, they even had that back then, was like embodying the, divine God of healing, something like that. That would give you a huge amount of confidence in whatever procedure, you'd be going through. And I am sure that it would massively increase the effectiveness of the procedure because of the power of the mind and belief and all that kind of stuff, and I think Joe Dispenza, who I mentioned earlier, is a great person. Not that there haven't been 1,000 other people teaching similar stuff, but I think the thing that distinguishes him is, he's done a lot of scientific studies to prove, these principles, which again is required in this day and age because that is our dominant paradigm. That is, the thing that we're supposed to believe in and that we all do believe in more than anything else, the vast majority of people anyway. So yeah, I'm totally open to all that other stuff. And, I think it would be cool in a way if, we could heal in that way that they did, but we can't, right? People don't believe in that kind of stuff generally. Even if a lot of people who talk about it, I notice in reality don't. They talk about whatever chakras or energies or this or that, but in my opinion, they often don't really truly believe it when the chips are down and, when it's an emergency, when there's something really wrong. And I absolutely do believe in the power of the mind. When I was going through that pain that wouldn't go away and I couldn't find an answer, I didn't just, hope to find a problem. I didn't just pray for healing. Well, the specific thing that I focused on was visualizing a point in future when not only would I be better, as in not in pain and not having this issue, but I would actually be better than I ever was before. And I imagine myself looking back at that moment and going, I'm so grateful what I went through this. That was the best thing that could ever happen to me, because if it wasn't for that, I wouldn't be able to do everything I'm doing now. So I was visualizing that back then in the height of the, physical stabbing pain. And I think that's super important to have that like mindset. And I highly encourage everyone, not just to be better, because to be better is like, maybe it's not enough. Like it's just about reaching how you were before. That's not enough to move your spirit, I would say. But like to really focus on, appreciation and gratitude and being in this place where the pain you've got going through is not only ceased and desisted, but actually you see it was entirely meaningful and, purposeful and all the rest of it. I think that's hugely important. And it's funny, I was just being interviewed the other day by other people who have this anti-aging program. And again, it's very scientific. One of them is a medical doctor, and they're kind of testing people's all kinds of stuff to prove that it's helping them reverse aging and all that kind of stuff. But they also have a mindset component, just like you were talking about. And I said, well, what percentage do you think of their success is the mindset component? And they found it hard to quantify, but they, at the end, they said about 50%. And I'd say that, funnily enough, that's what I was going to say. It's about 50%. Like that, your emotional state, how you actually feel, and the neuronal pathways you go down on a habitual basis, to put it scientifically, make a huge difference for your well-being. And I definitely think they are related to autoimmunity. We haven't even touched on that yet, but yeah, I don't know if you want to hear my theories on autoimmunity.
Yeah, I would love to dive in. And just before that, like for my own experience, since we're talking on mindset, yeah, I don't think the mindset necessarily cures lupus, which is what I have. But when I started learning about the power of words and my self-talk and my word choices when I'm speaking about my experience, when I learned how much those word choices could make a difference in my experience, and I started shifting them to that more, for lack of a better term, positive mindset versus the victim mindset. In my experience, my whole life trajectory shifted. Does that mean that I wasn't still experiencing symptoms? No, it didn't mean that, but it meant I was experiencing them much differently and seeing them in a whole different light than I used to. Prior to that, it's like, woe is me. What's wrong with me? My body's attacking itself. Like all these terrible things are impeding on my ability to do the things I want. And when you shift your mindset to, this is just an experience I'm going through right now, and, I might not be feeling good today, but tomorrow, who knows? Tomorrow's another day. Every day is a new day, shifting into more of that line of thinking just completely changed the way I experienced life. And I was just overall happier and overall could see more possibility in life despite having, an autoimmune disease. So yeah,
And a
with
potentially
that,
very debilitating disease. So yeah, I understand. I honor the challenge of shifting your mindset in that situation. It's extremely difficult. I know, again, one way of framing it, right, is that's almost why you've been given it, right? Because it develops that strength within you to shift, your mindset despite
exactly.
the physical pain and the physical symptoms, which are often severe. And it's something that if you manage to do that, it's something that's extremely valuable, not just for you, although it is valuable for you, but it's valuable for the whole world. There's not enough people out there who have the strength to do something like that. And there's certainly not enough people out there who have the strength to do something like that, who are putting a positive message out into the world regularly and helping people regularly. And so, yeah.
Well, I would love to know more about your thoughts on autoimmunity, if you can dive into
Yes.
that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll talk about the more scientific elements first, and then I'll also talk about the mindset stuff, which it sounds like a large degree of you, but I'll expand upon it with a little bit of other science stuff. So, okay. A lot of people do ask me, a lot of people are interested in losing weight, and they say, are genes the reasons why it's hard for me or someone who I know to lose weight? And I say, well, yes and no. So there is and I'm not just talking about this, I'm going to make the comparison to autoimmune in a sec, don't worry. There is definitely a genetic factor in weight gain and weight loss, meaning that yes, for some people, it is much harder to not be overweight than others because of genetics. That's a fact as far as I'm concerned. However, it's also a fact that 100 years ago, people were eating on average 3,000 to 4,000 calories a day, were not very active in many cases. Exercise wasn't even a thing until, it was invented in California in the 1960s, exercise for the sake of health. I mean, yes, people did physical labor, people did sports. I'm not saying people didn't have exercise, but I'm saying no one did exercise for its own sake until relatively recently. And yet, obesity was almost unheard of back then. It was extremely unusual. I think I saw a picture from a freak show, like World's Fattest Man or something it was called. And it was like someone who looked almost normal by today's standards. Like so something else is going on other than genetics. I'm saying all that to say that. So yes, there is a genetic component. There is a reason why, well, actually, all right. So if it's not that, what is it? I think, RFK Jr., who I know is creating some waves in your country at the moment, has done a really good job of like bringing this to mass awareness that there is a collective poisoning going on. And it seems to have massively increased and accelerated from the 1980s onwards. And, so we've gone from a time where allergies and intolerances and autoimmune diseases were extremely rare to, relatively extremely common. That's happened in the last few decades. And so there are a bunch of different poisons which could be the culprit, Probably, I know this is going on YouTube. We're not allowed to talk about all of them, but we can, maybe talk about a couple. One of them would be what's often not considered a poison, would be large amounts of seed oils, omega-6 fats, which have an effect of, poisoning the metabolism. They're very pro-inflammatory. And we've gone from a situation where they were like 1% to 2% of calories maybe 100 years ago to now around 30% of calories for the average person. So, I don't even know if that's in Kennedy's list actually, but it's certainly in my list of potential culprits. There's things like atrazine and PCBs and all kinds of things in the water. There's heavy metals in all kinds of places, which, due to industry and all the rest of it, people are being a lot more exposed to. There's plastics and phytoestrogens that people, their exposure to is massively increased. So there's all kinds of things. Now, how do we tie that back to genetics? Different people have different abilities to process different poisons. In fact, I'll tell my own story as an example of this, because this is one of the things that ended up being like the solution for me. So I saw in my genetic reports, I just noticed that I had a genetic tendency to not be able to process the two heavy metals very well. It was lead and cadmium. And so I'd already done a hair mill analysis before where it shows the heavy metals your body is excreting through your hair. I'd even done a urinary heavy metals test, and neither of them had shown significant levels of any heavy metals. But because I had this genetic test, I thought, you know what, I'm gonna do it. And so I got a really expensive test and included blood levels of the four most common heavy metals, those two, mercury and arsenic. And my blood levels of lead were sky high. The reference range, meaning 95% of people fall in it, is 0 to 3 in this range. Mine was 27. 45 is hospitalization by World Health Organization standards. So I was close to emergency hospitalization that I was a normal person. All the symptoms I had back then it could have been explained simply by that, lead poisoning. Unexplained abdominal pain, sharp abdominal pain is one of the symptoms of lead poisoning, as is unexplained weight loss, as is feeling cold all the time, as is the emotional disturbances I'm going through, everything. And so I went to a GP, a medical doctor. I said, could this explain all my symptoms? This is a mainstream medical doctor. They said, yeah, absolutely. And then I said, okay, what we can do about it? And they said, we'll retest you in a year. Oh, and they want to make sure I didn't have current exposure. And I said, well, look, my wife is drinking the same water as me, eating roughly the same food, taking roughly the same supplements, eating off the same plates, breathing the same air. Close enough, right? That, if it were something in my environment now. Anyway, she was tested, hers were like below 1, something like that, maybe 1. So it wasn't a recent exposure. Anyway, I looked into it. Turns out that lead is a heavy metal that has a half-life of 20 years. Your body stores in its bones. I probably had exposure a long time ago, and my body collected it in my bones. And then the ironic thing is, every time I tried to be healthy, all the stuff I was doing, it would speed up the release of the lead from my bones into my bloodstream and make me feel worse. Why do I bring all this up? Because I believe that these kind of toxins, like heavy metals, can absolutely be a root cause of things like autoimmune diseases. Luckily that wasn't how it manifested in my case, but so how would that be the case? Well, what is autoimmunity? To me, autoimmunity, food allergies and intolerances, and then even just general systemic inflammation, which many even mainstream medical people say is the root cause for a lot of chronic disease, whether it's heart disease, diabetes, all this kind of stuff. They're all the same. The only difference is the degree to which it ruins your life. Systemic infection will kill you very slowly. Food allergies and intolerances can really ruin your quality of life, but only if they're severe. Autoimmune disease definitely ruins your quality of life, and is extremely debilitating. But to me, the root of it is the same. So when they say inflammation, a lot of people use the word inflammation as if it's like a curcumin deficiency or something like that. But what is inflammation? Inflammation is a natural process of the immune system. And it's the body's first line of the immune system's response to a perceived threat, right? And so when we're talking about autoimmunity, we are obviously talking about the immune system attacking its own tissues. Now, the mainstream medical kind of and scientific community then focuses on what's wrong with the immune system. Like, why is the immune system not acting correctly? They have theories about, too much of the inflammatory cytokines, not enough of the regulatory ones, all of this kind of stuff, which I think there is certainly some validity to. But the question that no one is asking, that's why I'm glad, I use RFK as an example, somebody who's bringing into popular questions. The other thing is not just why is it attacking your own tissues, as in what's wrong with your immune system kind of line of questioning, but also how has it got so dysregulated that it started doing that? And is it definitely attacking your tissues, or is it actually responding to something else which is with your tissues? So for instance, is there some kind of actual foreign substance which may be, because it's actually very hard to test the inside of a living organism. We do blood tests and biopsies and stuff, but they're not perfect. Is the immune system purely deranged and dysregulated and kind of attacking nothing? Or is there actually some kind of poison there, whether it's a heavy metal, whether it's a PCB, whether it's some kind of glyphosate, whether it's some kind of something that the immune system is reacting to and attacking, but that medical science is in many cases not able to actually ascertain and work out that's what it is that your body is reacting to. So I think that's the huge missing piece. And so if I had autoimmunity, and in fact I kind of did, although it's the mild form of reaction to many different types of food, my first line of investigation was and would be, what toxins is my body struggling to deal with? Now, when we talk about toxins, what does it mean? A lot of people use the word toxin. What is it? A toxin is a poison. Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, it could mean a few different things. One of, in the case of lead, it's quite unusual as a toxin. What it actually does is it doesn't do anything. And what I mean by that is, so your body will mistake it for other things, most commonly calcium, and it will put it in the place in the cell where calcium should be, and then that cell becomes non-functioning because it's got this dead thing in there instead of this living bioelectric element, which should be performing a certain function. And so then that cell stops functioning and stops being able to do what it should do. Well, what about if that happens to a white blood cell? What about if that happens to a lot of white blood cells? What if that happens to a lot of the regulatory white blood cells? Would that give the potential for the offensive white blood cells to get out of control if a lot of the regulatory ones are, disabled or hobbled in that way? Absolutely, that's a possibility. But the more common type of toxin is that it is corrosive, right? Basically, it just destroys what it touches. And this is true of mercury. This is true of, mycotoxins. This is true of, a lot of the toxins that are focused on. It destroys what it touches. But what does destroy mean? Well, everything ultimately is, based on DNA, right? That's what the DNA is, and the RNA is the instructions that are reading it. And so what about if it's damaging the DNA of the cells, which are meant to be creating other cells? Well, what happens if you create a cell which is not functioning correctly because the code has been damaged, and so there's some kind of mutation that is undesirable? Well, the immune system should be going in and clearing away and getting rid of that cell before it creates further problems, before it mutates into cancer, before it becomes a senescent cell, which is a drain on the body's resources without providing any value, and maybe other stuff that we don't, fully understand yet. And so is it a possibility that, again, the immune system is not only stupid or dysfunctional or whatever, but it's trying to attack these cells which are not being created correctly because of this damage to the DNA, which these corrosive type of toxins have been created? I would say yes. What else could cause the cells to start creating other cells that are mutated enough that the immune system, even if it's functioning correctly, might react to? Another thing would be a lack of the substrates, the basic building blocks that are required for your body to make those cells. So if you're missing specific amino acids, if you're missing specific vitamins, minerals, the basic building blocks of cells, again, you can have a non-optimally functioning cell. And again, that could be something that your immune system reacts to. So that could be another reason. So these are all kind of things that are, largely or completely ignored by mainstream science. And that's why I think you're totally on the right track when you talked earlier about, nutrition and toxicity, I think you mentioned as well. And then, hormones play a huge part, right? I believe there is an epidemic of suboptimal thyroid functioning in our modern day society. And it's not the first time. So there was an epidemic of suboptimal thyroid functioning about 150-ish years ago throughout a lot of the so-called developed world at the time. And, symptoms included, unexplained weight gain, low energy, feeling cold, digestive disturbances, and yes, immune system disturbance. When the thyroid is not creating enough thyroid hormone, then your body often prioritizes the systems in your body which are required to keep you alive, like the respiratory system and the circulatory system and the brain, the nervous system, and it deprioritizes all the things that are more like luxury functions from its perspective, like digestion and detoxification and the immune system. Not that it gives these things no energy, but that it kind of puts them on austerity levels of energy. It doesn't give them high levels of energy. It's a bit like a hibernation mode. So when an animal hibernates for the winter, it's not fighting off any bacteria or viruses or whatever. All of that goes into a dormant state. And then when the animal goes out of hibernation, the immune system kicks in again and suddenly it starts dealing with all these things. And so it puts you into a bit of a hibernation mode when you don't have enough thyroid function, and it dysregulates the immune system. So chronic infections was known 100 years ago. Chronic, like sinus infections, urinary tract infections, digestive infections, skin infections. When you have chronic infections that keep coming back, that's a sign of low thyroid function. But allergies, intolerances, and I would also say autoimmune disease would also potentially be caused by low thyroid function because, again, your immune system doesn't have enough energy to function optimally. This can all be true even if everything I said before is true, because even if the problem is toxins, if your immune system has the optimal amount of energy, and when I say energy, I'm talking about anything vague, I'm talking about ATP, literal cellular energy from a scientific point of view. So when your immune system has an optimal amount of energy to function optimally, maybe it's more able to differentiate between your own tissues and, foreign invaders and actual toxins and infectious agents and all the rest of it. So it's still related. So about 100 years ago, if you had a lot of these symptoms, chronic infections, feeling cold, overweight, dry skin, constipation, ongoing digestive issues, low sex drive, hormonal issues like sex hormonal issues, they would say, oh, no problem. We're going to give you a bit of thyroid glandular. And if you feel better, great. If you feel better but not enough, we'll give you more. And they basically keep giving you more until you feel better. And then for some reason, whether it's stupidity, conspiracy, I don't know, rather than giving it out to maybe 30 to 40% of the population who needs it, they started limiting it. And now it's only to the 2% of the population who are the very worst and who literally can't function without it. And everyone else, they say, you don't need it. So that's a long story. We could do a whole episode on that. I do have a whole episode on my channel. But, that's it in a nutshell. So, that's another possible explanation. And, I do see, again, I haven't worked with many autoimmune people. I don't know what claim I have, but I do see the people who have those other signs of the immune system not functioning optimally, like chronic infections that keep coming back, or like allergies and intolerances, they often get resolved when a person optimizes their thyroid function. And then the last thing I'll say, to talk about the emotional issue, so have you heard of low-dose naltrexone? Have you heard of low-dose naltrexone? No. Okay. You definitely should. If there was one magic bullet that I would recommend to everyone who have autoimmunity to speak to your doctor about, because it is something that is available via prescription, it is low-dose naltrexone. It is the number one go-to thing for autoimmunity. And any smart doctor, it should be the first thing they recommend to you. If any doctor is not recommending it to you, then I would say you should seek another doctor. Personally, I would if I had that issue. So low dose naltrexone, what is it? It's incredibly interesting. I'd recommend there's someone who runs a research trust on this who might be a good guest on your show who could go through in great detail. But it's helpful for every type of autoimmune situation. It's also helpful for all kinds of other things. So what is it? So naltrexone is a drug that is generally given to heroin addicts or alcoholics who want to quit that addiction. And so the way that it works is it blocks the opiate or several opiate receptors or endorphins receptors. And so what it means is if you take a, let's say, normal dose of naltrexone and then you shoot heroin, you don't feel it. And so that's a very good way of stopping taking heroin or any opiate is if you don't feel it. Now, you're going to go through some suffering with that. Obviously, it's still, not going to prevent the withdrawal phase with opiate addiction. And so I would say its use in that context is probably more, questionable, in the case of addiction, even though that's the primary use for it. But the interesting thing is they discovered that if you give a low dose, so a 10th or sometimes even 100th, and some people say 1,000th, like a tiny amount of the dose that you would give to that addict, it has a very interesting effect. So what it does is it blocks the endorphins, these endorphin receptors. And so endorphins are the things that make you feel. There's a bunch of different endorphin receptors. I think there's at least a dozen endorphins that have been studied. Probably the most stimulating is one called phenylethylamine, PEA, which is something that's found in chocolate. And they say it makes you kind of feel in love. So it's quite euphoric and it's very stimulatory. And others are, but generally most of them are, fairly, not stimulating, but they're kind of between euphoric and blissful. That's how endorphins make you feel. And, for a lot of people, endorphins is the best feeling in the world. Men actually have a bit higher endorphins than women, and women's endorphins also change along with their cycle. And so I'll get to autoimmunity in a second, I promise. It's definitely related to this. That's why for a lot of women, they'll notice at one part of their cycle, their autoimmune symptoms will be worse than another. This speculates that endorphins have a big role in it. Because it turns out, and this is really fascinating, that the master controllers of the immune system is not cortisol, stress, it's not serotonin, it's not dopamine, it's not even thyroid, though having thyroid at the right level is hugely helpful to give the energy that the immune system needs. The master controller of the immune system is actually the endorphin system. This barely studied system, which funnily enough, talked about spiritual stuff, it kind of corresponds to crown chakra. It corresponds to cosmic consciousness. It corresponds to a blissful state. And it turns out that this is actually the master regulator of the immune system. And so a lot of the time when people have very strong immune system dysregulation, you will see that even before that started, they had issues with a lack of joy, a lack of bliss, a lack of euphoria. Maybe a lot of the time they were feeling spiritually disconnected, spiritually isolated, maybe through no fault of their own. Maybe they're in survival mode. Maybe, they're just trying to get by, a little bit like I was describing how I was when I was young. Life was just a struggle and I was just trying to get by and just trying to survive. And so that feeling of profound spiritual connection, euphoria that endorphins give you, interestingly, actually creates a regulating experience in immune system in a way that science doesn't, quite fully understand. And so now that's a theory, but the interesting thing is in reality, in practice, when you give this low dose naltrexone, so what it does, often they give it to you to take at night. And then at night, while you're asleep, your body blocks these endorphin receptors. Now, if you're saying, the problem is endorphins, why wouldn't opioids make me feel better? No, because the problem is endorphins, like with dopamine, your body is very much always trying to down-regulate them and stop you having an excessive level of them. So meaning it kind of feels unfair in a way, but it's also interesting, like with oxytocin, which they often call the love hormone, your body doesn't downregulate it. The more oxytocin you create, the more that is created in cells. Very interesting. So love multiplies, but dopamine, which is related to drive, desire, motivation, enthusiasm, all those kind of things, your body stops it getting too high. It doesn't want you to be overjoyed. It wants you to be just joyed enough. And then with endorphins, it doesn't want you to be overly euphoric. And this makes sense because even though I might love to be euphoric all day, every day, and you might love to be that way, in practice, you're not going to get a lot of surviving and reproducing done if you're constantly euphoric. So the endorphin system is supposed to be a system, according to mainstream conventional scientific thinking, that's there for emergencies. Like if a wolf has come up to you and it's bitten your leg, if you are aware of how painful that is or what a dangerous situation you're in, you'll probably freak out and you'll probably get eaten. But if you can go into I don't feel any pain and I'm okay state of consciousness, then you can go, oh, I better fight back, I better run away, I better call for help, whatever. So it helps you cope in those extreme situations. That's the point of view, endorphins, from a mainstream scientific point of view. And so, but a lot of us so it helps you disassociate, to use psychotherapeutic language. It helps you disassociate so that you can cope and so that you can survive. But a lot of us get in the habit of disassociating, especially if we've been through trauma, PTSD, complex PTSD. And so we start overstimulating our own endorphins on an ongoing basis because we keep disassociating, even if we're not, maybe you've never used an opioid, you've never touched any of those, but you're still kind of creating that effect because you keep abusing your own endorphin system to disassociate and not be aware of things. And so there's still this down regulation that's going on. So that's one factor. Another factor is we have a genetic rapport on endorphins. Some people have genetically high endorphins, some people have genetically low endorphins. As I said, overall, women have generally lower endorphins than men. And I believe women are substantially more likely to suffer from autoimmunity than men. As you said, at the time, just before the period and the period, when the other hormones drop, the endorphins also drop. So that's why generally you feel less euphoric and less emotionally resilient during that time. Like endorphins are a part of that pattern, although it's also hormones. And so the way that low-dose naltrexone works is the opposite of an opioid. So the opioid hits that receptor, which then increases that feeling of euphoria, but then the body goes, oh, this is a lot, and it will down-regulate your own endorphin production, and it will down-regulate the sensitivity of that receptor. And so next time, it's harder for you to feel euphoric. So taking opioids, they say, the first time you take it is the best time you ever take it, but, before long, you don't feel euphoric anymore when you take it, but you feel, the depths of pain and despair if you don't take it. So, that's because it's down-regulates so much. So this naltrexone works the opposite. It blocks the receptor, which makes your body go, oh, I better upregulate the production of natural endorphins, and I better upregulate the sensitivity of the receptors. And so that's the theory as to how it works. Now, that's a simplified version. I actually think it's more complicated. I actually think it hits some receptors and not others. I think it's actually more complicated than scientists have worked out. But the bottom line is, as I said, for someone who knows what they're doing, it's the go-to medicine for someone with autoimmunity. I don't know about lupus. I wish I could say I did, but I first found it when I was looking for something to help someone with Hashimoto's, and it's it's the go-to thing for Hashimoto's, again, among people who know what they're doing, and for some other autoimmune stuff as well, Sjogren syndrome, I believe it's definitely useful for. But I think this website is called LDN Trust. They've got a huge list of all the conditions that low-dose naltrexone can help with, and you can see if lupus is on that list. Even if it's not, I would say it's worth a try, because in the high normal doses, it's a bit, iffy if that's a good idea. But the tiny amounts that you use for this treatment be shown to be extremely safe, extremely low in side effects, definitely worth a try given the potential benefit, versus side effect profile. In my opinion, seek a doctor's advice. This is prescription only. So yeah, so go back to feelings and emotions and all the rest of it. Someone who naturally has lower endorphins will find it harder to experience bliss, will find it harder to feel euphoria, will find it harder to feel that kind of spiritual connection with the world, will be more likely to be in a victim state of consciousness, will be more likely to feel like, life is a struggle to survive, will be more likely to be traumatized by traumatic experiences and not be able to let it go, or to find it more difficult to let it go and, be present and all that kind of stuff. And so to me, that might explain the biochemical, physical basis of the correlation that you've seen between emotion and trauma and autoimmune symptoms.
Just blew my mind with so much information there and stuff that I
Sorry.
have not. No, this is me thinking.
Okay.
Yeah, no, this is all stuff that's when it comes to the endorphins. That's new information to me and gives me a lot to think about and a lot to now go out and research. I'm so glad that you brought that into the conversation. There's so many nuances and health in general, and then you get all the way over to the autoimmune side of things, and it's like, there's so much there depending on the depth that you want to go to.
It's vast.
Yeah.
I've been extremely fortunate. As much as I say no practitioner solved what was going on with me or cured me, I've met a lot of great ones along the way who've given me really helpful stuff like this. In fact, funny enough, I was doing a consult with a doctor today, and it's someone who had severe MCAS, histamine stuff, and all the rest of it. And I'd already been working a little bit, and they said, I'm also going to give you low dose naltrexone. I was like, oh my God, I did a whole video training on allergies and MCAS. It's on my podcast. Low dose naltrexone is there, and somehow I'd forgotten with this client to recommend it to them. I was like, oh, felt silly. I was like, thank God. So yes, there is a hell of a lot to know. Even if you've done a video guide to it, you can still, forget about it. It's crazy. There is a lot to know with these things. But yeah, I would recommend it. I'll give you, a few links to books if, you want to study it in detail. But yeah, to me, it's fascinating. And I love studying this stuff. I don't know if you looked into endocannabinoids. It's not as impactful, but, endocannabinoids also have an impact on the, the immune system and the CB2 receptors specifically. But I think, again, in practice, CBD, as much as it does help with anti-inflammation, from what I've seen, it's not really that effective for allergies, intolerances, or autoimmunity. So it wouldn't be my go-to thing. But it is another interesting thing to look into, and it can potentially help to calm the immune system, even if it doesn't resolve the dysregulation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it could definitely be another tool, not one of the tools that can help. And that's what I think is so important to understand about health, and especially the complicated issues, is it's never just one thing. It's finding pieces of the puzzle that connect, and you've just, given our listeners so much information that can help connect some of those puzzle pieces, or find the puzzle pieces that they have been looking for. Gosh, I
just want to add something.
Hours.
I love this. I'm going to say one more thing about endorphins, if that's okay. A lot of the time, and I know this is totally cliche stereotype city, so you can edit it out if you don't like it, but a lot of the time, women say that men are emotionally insensitive, and and then men are like, oh, she's overly emotional. Well, even that cliche may be rooted at least partly and maybe significantly in endorphins, because when you have high levels of endorphins, it's easy to feel happy. But it's actually hard to feel truly compassionate for someone else's suffering, because as far as you're concerned, everything's good, right? And so there is actually a benefit. And I want to say this because it can often feel with these things, let's say, you start to identify, oh, I am actually someone who's had low endorphins my whole life. That does explain a lot. Maybe you go down that train of thought. It can be easy to get into, oh God, poor me. I've got low endorphins. That's really hampered the quality of my life. And in one way it's true. But if it's true, but another way of looking at it is actually it will give you a level of compassion and empathy for other people that someone who has naturally high endorphins, it totally lacks. And while, it may be easy to envy that person with high endorphins because they don't have the suffering that you have, but they may also not have the level of, compassion, understanding. They may be quite disassociated. They may be very disconnected from their own feelings, which may have led them down some very incorrect choices in life. You probably have seen that a lot of time when people are disconnected from their feelings, they make some really bad choices that often hurt themselves and other people. And so I just wanted to kind of finish with that, all of these things that, can be seen bad, or we've been dealt a bad hand in our genetics, there is always an upside in my experience. And I definitely know the one for endorphins, and I would say I was one of those people. I was a little bit like oblivious and judgmental of other people's feelings when I was younger, and then going through this period with this pain, and I do correlate it as well to low levels of endorphins. Otherwise, I just, the pain wouldn't have been so bad if I had high endorphins. It's just the way endorphins work. I think I depleted mine after years and years of disassociating because of trauma in early life. And I'm very glad I went through that experience again. Although, I wouldn't want to go for the pain again if I could avoid it. I think it deepened me as a person and made me much more genuinely caring and understanding of other people's suffering and less judgmental. And so I think there's a real benefit to having low endorphins as well. I don't think it's as simple as high endorphins are good, low endorphins are bad, even though they make you feel euphoric. It's not as simple as that.
I see it as, it's yin and yang. If we're going back to traditional Chinese medicine or any traditional models, everything's always somewhat in flow and in flux. And at some point in your life, you might be more on the yin side or some point more on the yang side, so at some point you might be on the low endorphin side. At some point you might have been able to correct that or overcorrected and you're more on the other side of things. And I think all of that is valuable. We learn from all of that, all of these life experiences. It's like, yeah, I've been dealing with health issues for 20 years now, but I've learned so dang much along the way. Like, if I hadn't have gone through that, where would I be right now? I mean, I guess I would have just had another path, but it's like, I think there's so much value in being able to honor our paths. However, anything that we've gone through that have gotten us to this point, like finding that compassion for our own story and the self-worth and just the importance in our own story and what we've gone through, and be able to honor that. And then pair that with all the stuff we've just been talking about, pair that with the genetics testing, pair that with all these other things and all these other informational pieces that we could put in our tool belt. And we just have the opportunity to become like the most amazing version of ourselves. We just keep with this, keep with your own heart. Like, don't forget who you really are on the inside. And that's just another message that I think is so important, is like, just honor yourself underneath all the health issues, underneath all the mental or emotional struggles, underneath all the traumas. All the stuff that we've just talked about is good information, but you have to use it to get to the root of who you really are. And that's just like at the core of it all.
Yep.
So we literally could talk for many more hours. We've been talking for a long time, and I would love to know, before we close this, if there is anything that we haven't touched on yet that you think is really, vital that our listeners know or hear or understand, or, any resources that you want to leave them with.
Yeah, I think I probably covered the main things that I would give as leads for people to follow. But yeah, I have more information on pretty much everything I've just talked about on my channel, youtube.com/Elwin Robinson, but also I'm on the Rejuvenate podcast. It's on all the major podcast platforms. And my episodes are less kind of interview format, usually, and more like topic based. So, I have an episode on allergies and intolerances, for instance, which we talked about. I have an episode on thyroid, which we talked about. I may well do an episode on autoimmunity. You've inspired me, actually. I hadn't gotten to it. It's maybe because I haven't worked with that many people and helped them with it, but I could do a speculative episode. And of course, my service, Genetic Insights, which gives that valuable information, which, as I said, I consider a first step in the process, geneticinsights.co. And in fact, I would like to offer your viewers a reward for listening this long with a coupon code. So as I said, we already aim to be and I believe are, the most affordable of all the true full-service genetic platforms out there that help with health and wellness. But I would like to offer your listeners an additional 25% off with the coupon HealthBridge. No spaces, HealthBridge, all capitals. That will get you an additional 25% off. And you can use that for any of our packages, but our Limitless is probably going to give you all the information that we've talked about today and much more. And then, the other thing I have is my website, feelyounger.net, which just gives, some of the resources as well, which, I've talked about today. But I'd say the And the reason I say YouTube first, because I'm very active on there. So if you have any questions you want to ask me, then leave it in the comments to my videos and I will reply to it there.
Awesome. Yeah. I basically want you to take me on as a student at this point. I want to keep learning from you, but I definitely am very interested in doing the genetic testing. And also to clarify with the listeners, if they've already done like an ancestry.com or a 23andMe type genetics test, is that something that applies to your product as well? They can upload the results they already have.
Yeah, so the way it works is, so with the URL I gave, geneticinsights.co, if you go to that's like our main page that offers our limitless insights, that's everything. And so you'll see two options there. You'll see with a DNA kit and without a DNA kit. Without a DNA kit is really simple. If you select that, your price will be under $150 if you use your coupon, and they'll give you immediate access to everything. So if you do that, you go to check out the usual stuff, and then you'll go into your membership area and you upload your raw data from one of those other services. If you don't know how to get it, just email their customer service or use the chat and say, please give me my raw data, and they will give it to you. It's just, it's an attachment. You upload it to our system. Our extremely extensive AI system will get working on it. This is an AI system that is very advanced. It's got several dozen full-time AI engineers working in it. It's got several dozen full-time research scientists. This is, really, as far as I'm concerned, there is no better system in the world currently. So it's going to process that. It will take a few hours because it's churning a huge amount of data, and then it will give you your results. It will give you, as I say, hundreds of these reports in this membership area. You can sort it by risk. You can see your highest risk things first. You can just scroll through and there's various different categories. If you have autoimmunity, you might go to the category of immune system first, or you might go to the category of allergies and intolerances and just have a look. If you don't have that raw data because you've never done a service like that, then it's not really that much more complicated, but it just takes longer. So in that case, you would order the version with the DNA kit. You'll still be given the same membership and all the rest of it, but you'll also be sent a physical DNA kit. When you receive it, or depending on what country you're in, you'll be given either a cheek swab or a little tube to spit saliva into. You send it off. It's pretty simple, certainly more convenient than a blood test or whatever. But the main problem is it just takes a while. It could take 4 to 8 weeks. It can even take longer, though that's pretty unusual. I say that because that's what the lab tells us. In reality, it's been quicker recently, but I don't even know when this is coming out, and I certainly can't guarantee it'll be quicker by the time it does come out. But yeah, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about a month or two, which I realize, is a long time to wait. So that's really the worst thing about our service, I would say, is how long you have to wait to get your results if you haven't done like a DNA ancestry test before. But we do provide that service. And if you want to use someone else's, if you want to use Ancestry or any of these other services, then you can feel free to do that. And then once you have the data from them, you can add it to our service. But I would sign up for the membership now because the coupon code won't be around forever.
Awesome. Thank you so much for just again showering us with so much really quality information. I hope that if everyone goes out and does their DNA test with you, as you said, they get 500 different tests. That's a lot of information, but just to say to people, you don't get overwhelmed by it. Just take it one thing at a time. That's all you got to do. Like you said, the one woman just added a vitamin D and a B12 and maybe one other thing, and she saw some amazing results. So
I'm amazed how often that happens. People only do a couple of simple things, and because it's the right few simple things, it makes a profound difference.
Right. And that's what your test can help them figure out. What are those right few things? So thank you so much for being on. And I look forward to hopefully doing another podcast with you in the future.
Thank you. If you're open to it, we can look at your results once you have them and talk about them either on a podcast or just you and I and maybe talk about it afterwards. But I've done a few of those now and it's really fun.
We will absolutely schedule that. Thank you. Thank you so much for being on, Elwin. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
So what did you all think of this conversation with Elwin? I love that one of his main points is that there are no bad genetics, right? There are no good genes and bad genes. There are no when we were talking about endorphins, well, you're lucky because you have higher endorphins and I'm unlucky because I have lower endorphins. Well, no, it doesn't work that way. There are pros and cons to everything, right? And too much of a good thing is still too much. Too low of something is too low. So this is all about learning how to use the information that you can get from genetic testing to empower yourself with information to understand yourself on a different level than you've, been able to know yourself before. This gives you really in-depth insight and very actionable tools that you can use no matter what your health, lifestyle, emotional state is at the moment. This will give you such valuable insight. I also think that, there is so much information out there by a million different doctors and practitioners and researchers. And it can be really confusing to navigate because some people out there are promoting the vegan or vegetarian diet and showing all of these studies and research articles that prove that this is the ideal diet and you should be following it too, right? Or there's the full-blown carnivore lion diet, and there's a ton of research to back that up as well, probably even more than the vegan side. And so, how do you know with all these different things, all these different modalities, not just with nutrition, but with, every kind of practitioner there is out there, how do you know for sure which one is the right one for you? We can't say that this genetic testing will tell you exactly, but it gives you a really good roadmap to follow to figure out where to start. And, we just spoke about that at the end of the conversation. This is just a really valuable guide to have. And it's another puzzle piece that you can add to your puzzle to connect the dots for you. So if you are in a space where you are struggling to figure out your path with autoimmunity or lupus or any other health struggle, I definitely recommend that you take advantage of the really generous discount that he offered. This is information that you can use for the rest of your life. You only have to do it once. So I highly recommend that you take advantage of that. And if you're interested in what I was talking about and how I coach with my clients on building up that foundational health and all of the different categories that we focus on to help that communication in your body work together rather than disassociate and go haywire, well, reach out to me. Apply for a call. Let's get in a conversation. I would love to chat with you more about it and see if this is something that feels aligned for you. At the end of the day, do you have anything to lose? When it comes to this genetic testing, when it comes to inquiring about my coaching process, you don't have anything to lose. There's only to gain. It may or may not be the right fit for you, but you are going to get something valuable out of it regardless. And so I really hope that we can have a conversation and, just discuss where you're at in your health journey and where you would like to be and see if we can help set that roadmap for you to move forward with purpose, right? With purpose. So thank you so much for listening to this amazing episode. We are definitely scheduling a follow-up, so stay tuned for that. And definitely reach out to both Elwin and I and let us know the thing that you learned that surprised you the most or that struck you the most out of this conversation. I look forward to hearing from you, and I look forward to seeing you again on the next episode of the HealthBridge Podcast.